We're now starting the second of our panels on innovation in graduate education during COVID. This one focuses more on innovations, as Deborah said earlier, on innovations in processes and policies and practices. In a few minutes, we'll be joined by three of your colleagues, Vitek Hodgko-Zyko of the University of Illinois, Clay Gloucester of North Carolina A&T, and Claudia Tomini of St. Cloud State. And before starting our discussion with them, we'll once again review some of the broader findings from our survey. Really, there were two major areas that our survey revealed where institutions were both struggling and innovating with regards to policies and practices. The first had to do with international graduate students, and I think in particular, how institutions could go about providing financial support for students if, like we saw yesterday and even from some of the conversations earlier today, those international students were unable to gain entry to the United States or be on campus. As this graph shows, most institutions, that's 80% or more, indicated that they should be able to or would be able to either overall sort of a blanket yes or on a case-by-case or department-by-department basis to provide paid assistantships to domestic or international students who resided in the United States, even if they weren't on campus. And I think you probably can figure this out on your own, but RA is research assistantship, GA is graduate assistantship, and TA is, of course, a teaching assistantship. But for international students who were not in the United States, who were stuck abroad, less than half of campuses, and really only less than 20% were definite about this, indicated that their foreign-based international students could serve in assistantships and essentially be paid by the university. For some campuses, this was in some ways a political question. Public institutions, the whole idea of public institutions sending state money to foreigners was just not something that was politically viable or possible. But for others, there were simply way too many logistic and legal hurdles. How on earth, for example, do you collect I-9 information and verify somebody's identification if you can't even see them, if they're not really even in front of you? So, and then, of course, there was a bigger issue, which was the fact that our federal immigration authorities kept flip-flopping on what was the expectation and what was going to be allowed of international students. Other institutions, however, were able to overcome this in several ways. And despite some pretty enormous regulatory and tax burdens, some institutions were able to engage third parties to essentially hire their grad students. Other institutions were able to convert assistantships to scholarships and grants, which allowed them to give money to students, but not require the employment aspect of it. And other campuses developed new types of assistantships that students could perform from abroad. So for example, being a virtual teaching assistant or something along those lines. And we'll hear about some of these practices from our panelists. The second major area of policy innovation, as you can see from the slide, occurred in the admissions process. Once again, prior to COVID, just a small fraction of institutions in our study reported using virtual or online technology for interviews or campus visits. But during COVID, more than 2/3 adopted these practices. But perhaps even more transformational were several other adaptations that many institutions implemented. Most notably, the number of institutions reporting the use of holistic review doubled from 40% before COVID to 80% during and hopefully after COVID. That change, combined with numerous other changes in admissions processes, all related in some way, such as waiving standardized test requirements, waiving English proficiency exams, expanding consideration of pass-fail and credit, no credit courses, and extending deadlines, those all eased numerous hurdles and have the potential to expand the STEM pipeline for many groups that have traditionally been underrepresented or marginalized within these fields. Groups such as women, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students, students with disabilities, and those with multiple minoritized identities. The exact effects of these changes, however, are still to be seen. But COVID has provided a natural experiment, as Deborah kind of indicated before, and goodness knows that we PhDs always love a good experiment, to test the effects of these changes and the opportunity to reconsider traditional admissions practices. Beyond these two broad areas, however, COVID has forced institutions to reevaluate virtually all of their policies and procedures. COVID put all institutional processes under a microscope, and it quickly highlighted and magnified the things that were not working or things that were not serving any important purpose. So changes were made, obviously, in administrative processes. Think of all the e-forms and e-signatures and e-files that have occurred or changed on your campus. And for example, that we learned about in the last session. They've placed a renewed emphasis on different ways of assessing students' academic progress and their practices in the classroom. They've changed notions of what constitutes research and led to a reconsideration of what fees, expenses, and benefits are appropriate for graduate students. And of course, many, many other items. We've already heard about some of these from our previous folks, and we're going to hear some more too very shortly. Finally, and this is a topic that we have returned to time and time again during this convening, there is also a larger, much more overarching policy and practice question that has emerged in conjunction with the COVID pandemic. That's racial and social justice on our campuses and in our graduate programs. As one of our respondents wrote in response to our survey, parallel with the impacts of COVID-19 has been a rise in awareness of social justice issues. I think that the impact of the latter, meaning the justice issues, on this campus and on STEM fields will be significant and perhaps obscure the effects of COVID. To me, all of us, both researchers and academic leaders, have a moral obligation to identify and redress the historical and systemic injustices that are embedded in our institutions, particularly within STEM graduate programs. This is an area that we must all, I think, commit, and in hopes of truly transforming our institutions and the broader society. And I think even recently, less than 2 weeks ago, there was a great letter published in the magazine Science that had signatures from more than 10,000 scientists and others in higher education, calling upon higher education in general and STEM fields in particular to make sure that they're using this moment to ensure and better examine the equity of our practices and of our fields. And so, with that broad call to arms, I'm going to welcome in our panelists. But here's the question I'm hoping you can address, and that is, what are some of the most exciting or promising innovations that you've used at your institution? And those could be really within any area of graduate education.
You know, when we think about the implications of the pandemic for the University of Illinois, so University of Illinois, a very large public research university, more than 50,000 students. We have 17,000 graduate students. I think you could divide the innovations that have occurred in maybe 4 buckets. First, directly related to the pandemic and the treatment of the pandemic itself. Secondly, innovations with respect to policy and procedures that directly affect graduate students, how we handle different things like examinations, how we handle admissions criteria. So you were talking, Jim, about standardized examinations. So those kinds of innovations. Then there were innovations related to students as employees. We were one of the universities that chose to pay every international graduate assistant who was on a fellowship or on an assistantship. Didn't matter if they were on a research assistantship or a teaching assistantship. So there were a number of innovations related to student employees. But then finally, I think one of the things that perhaps hasn't been focused on as much is how recent innovations in the nature of the delivery of graduate programs has been hugely impacted by the pandemic. So 5 years ago, when I became Dean of the Graduate College, we had about 10,000 grad students at Illinois, 5,000 doctoral students, 5,000 master's degree students. I just said it's 17,000 students today. And it's still a little bit more than 5,000 doctoral students, but close to 10,000 master's degree students and 1,000 non-degree students. So where did those increases come from? They came from online master's degrees that were put, for the most part, in professionally related areas. And what the pandemic has done on our campus is, first of all, underscore the wisdom of developing online master's degrees. But secondly, encouraged many units that have yet to develop online programming to start looking at that much more consistently. So we actually implemented a number of policy changes that would allow units with on-campus graduate degrees to fast track the addition of an online version of that degree during the pandemic with the full support of our academic senate on campus. So I think in all of these areas, probably every one of our campuses has been forced to innovate with respect to policy and practice. And of course, the $64,000 question is which of those innovations we will maintain and continue and build on post-pandemic.
I sit at a different type of institution at North Carolina Agricultural Technical State University. We're the largest HBCU in the country, number one public HBCU as recognized by US News and World Report. And we're actually third in the UNC system in externally funded research. Our enrollment is much smaller than Illinois, but we were extremely proud in the midst of COVID to experience a 6.99% increase in graduate student enrollment. And that was the highest enrollment growth that we've experienced even over the past 5 years. So in the midst of COVID, even though we did not do anything really to increase the presence of international students because they could not get visas, etc., we were still able to increase our graduate enrollment. And we found that much of the increase was on the master's student side, but our PhD population, our doctoral student population, stayed about the same from last year. One of the largest efforts that we started during COVID was the university had a strategic priority for graduate education. So they invested significantly more funds in securing an external vendor. That external vendor targeted 9 of our master's programs, specifically on social media, all aspects of social media. They developed the capital, the collateral to put on our social media platforms, and we were engaged in a significantly increased marketing effort. Even though we started late, it was even like April or May when we started, but we noticed that it had a good impact. We also increased the frequency of our graduate information sessions. We began to hold them monthly, and we held them entirely online. And we noticed that we had increased attendance in those graduate information sessions. Another thing we did during the spring semester was to establish an admissions application processing task force where we shared best practices in processing applications from a holistic review perspective. And so we engaged regularly with our graduate program coordinators to try to decrease the number of days, the average number of days from the application being submitted to the decisioning of the application, because we noticed that those programs who were very efficient in processing applications had increased enrollment. We also started the chat bot on our graduate college website, and we have targeted campaigns because the bot is linked to SMS text messaging. So we have campaigns targeted towards prospective students. We also will have campaigns around retention, and we provide information to our students about upcoming events, etc., because they're used to communicating via text messaging. And one thing we noticed, we have an NSF grant entitled Preparing Future Minority Faculty, and we would hold an annual symposium each year. And we would invite speakers from various institutions or from the government agencies like NASA, et cetera. And we noticed this year an increased attendance, because typically when those speakers come to campus, they would come by themselves, and then we would have a small student population that would engage with them. But because of COVID, because the symposium was virtual, each one of those speakers brought with them a group, if you will, from their respective institution. And so we were able to have students from the West Coast to the East Coast participate in our symposium.
Thank you so much, Clay. That's wonderful. Claudia, would you like to add maybe some of the things that have been going on at St. Cloud State?
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Claudia Tammany. I serve as the Associate Provost for Research and Dean of Graduate Studies at St. Cloud State University. St. Cloud is one of 7 state universities in the Minnesota State Universities and Colleges system, which altogether educates about 235,000 students, and we have between 10 and 12,000 of them. St. Cloud is a mid-sized city. Our campus is on the river of the Mississippi, about an hour northwest of Minneapolis. So we have a campus in Plymouth in the outskirts of Minneapolis as well. So we have between 1,500 and 2,000 graduate students over the past 10 years. Most of them are in master's or doctoral programs that are oriented toward professional applications. So most of our students are engineers pursuing a management degree, or teachers who want to be a principal or a superintendent, medical device technology, areas like that. So like Wojtek also said, we already had experience teaching students online who have many different obligations and burdens and worries, and who are distracted, and for whom pursuing their degree is only one of the challenges. So we had a group of faculty who are very engaged in teaching STEM-related fields online and creating a pedagogy that builds on short videos, not like a long, 1-hour recorded lecture that will kill the will to live in our students. Then connect that with application, with reflection, with exercises as a group, both synchronous and asynchronous, so students can move at their own pace. So we had a knowledge base on campus. So when we had to go online in the spring, we gave faculty 2 weeks, so spring break and another week, and to figure out how they want to continue the semester. We were also anticipating that we would be under the same conditions for the coming year. So that's where a second feature of our university comes in. We are a unionized campus, democratic, very shared governance oriented. So we don't have a faculty senate. We interact between bargaining units. So the president engaged the entire campus in the early spring, March, April, to discuss how the coming year would look. And we had a lot of buy-in from faculty for all kinds of blended methods. The third thing I want to say is that we serve a great variety of students from many different backgrounds. We are very proud of that. So from that, it follows that we went to a radically individualized, personalized response to the crisis. We didn't close down the campus. We didn't send all students home because we know that some of them don't have internet on their farm, or they don't have a safe home to go to, or they have a job in St. Cloud, they wouldn't have an income if we sent them back. So we went to about half the occupancy in the dorms. We are now at single occupancy, and we continue to provide services, including health services and access to a food pantry. We run a large community garden, things like that continued, and that helped us continue to engage the student. As regards what Clay said about enrollment, we have an issue with students who have opted to take a break, especially those who work as teachers, for example, who have themselves children in the K-12 system, and for whom, like, also then pursuing an online degree is sort of the breaking point of what they can personally do and what the family can do. So in terms of policy innovation, we've made it a lot easier to step out, to take a break, and to return again. And we have, as a matter of course, extended the time to degree by a year for all our graduate students to help them sort of get through this current crisis healthy with their families and then come back to us. And the last thing I want to say is, because the governor of Minnesota made it mandatory to wear face masks and observe social distancing, that has been a major tool for us to be able to be open, because it's not us mandating you have to wear a mask. It's a statewide mandate that is followed pretty rigorously. So I personally feel safe when I'm on campus, which is about 6 to 8 hours a week.
One of the sort of common things that have come up both in sort of the overall results that we had, but also just from some of the things you've talked about, really has to do with changes in admissions, right? And how those processes have changed. And one of the biggest ones is the shift to more holistic review, partially because many students were not able to take standardized tests or could not take the TOEFL or something along those lines. I'm curious if you all could talk maybe a little bit about how your institutions responded to the almost lack of some information or of customary information with regards to like standardized tests, and then about what, if any, kind of impact you've seen or witnessed so far in terms of what your class or your recruitment is like. And there was a question that popped up, and so there's going to be a follow-up to this, so I'll get to it soon, but let's start with that.
From the perspective of policy, we allowed programs the option to waive the GRE this academic year due to COVID. We informed them that they would have to go through a more extensive process once COVID lifts to sort of keep that in place and use data to substantiate removal of the GRE. Most of our master's programs do not require the GRE. However, there are a few that still require it. So from that perspective, many of our programs were very accommodating to students, particularly like international students who were not able to have transcript evaluation and the like. So as a graduate college, we tried to be very accommodating in situations where students had problems taking standardized tests or sending their scores to the institution. And so we allowed them a lot of flexibility around those issues.
You know, I would say that at Illinois, we have a very decentralized approach towards standardized testing. So we do not have a campus-wide requirement for the GRE, and programs are welcome to require the GRE, but they're also welcome to not look at it or make it test optional. And there's been some movement towards increasing the number of programs that are test optional, but that was in effect prior to the pandemic. And so we just simply reminded departments that it was up to them. And if they wanted to suspend the GRE, which almost all of them did, because for a while it was impossible to take it, we told them that that was entirely up to them. Now, with respect to English proficiency testing, for a while, both TOEFL and IELTS were not available, and we provided departments with the flexibility to use some other approaches. But we also encourage departments to simply interview students with a Zoom process, and that we were willing to accept that in lieu of standardized tests. So we basically instituted a maximum flexibility process. Now, what the impact will be post-pandemic, we're not sure. I mean, we never have required the GRE as a standardized test. We have required English proficiency testing, but we've often followed up with on-campus English language testing for international students. And I suspect we will continue with a somewhat flexible process that allows units the ability to choose what works for them.
It's the same with us that, we have looked at the GRE before because we feel that it is also a tool that excludes certain groups of students that we would like to recruit, not just because it's expensive or because it might require preparation that students aren't able to do, but because it's a mental or a psychological hurdle as well. When our data shows that the success of a student in a STEM program, it's really more dependent on their personal resilience, the social support they have, on the motivation that brings them into the program, than the sort of scientific and mathematical sort of minutiae, if you will, that they have in their minds at the point when they apply. So we also, it's optional in that departments set the requirements for admission to their program. So we have already a number of departments who don't require it. For this year, we didn't require it from any student and just sort of, waived the requirement for all the new students that came in. The other thing that we used to require is that students send an original transcript and that with an evaluation from an approved agency. That also proved to be difficult this year. And so we actually then evaluated the degrees ourselves. There were some lessons there, for example, that our students really only come from about 100 different institutions worldwide, where we have pretty high confidence that those are real degrees and this is how they look. But we waived those requirements, including like vaccination requirements and so on for all students, and gave them, if they didn't have this, conditional admission for the fall, so that they would have a grace period until October now, when registration for spring and summer starts, to bring those missing documents. And as Wojtek said, of course, now at this point, there's the conversation like, how are we going to continue with this? So we might look at an in-house evaluation of international transcripts going forward as well, to further sort of lower the hurdle for access.
Great, thanks. So the sort of $100 million question then that follows up from this, and a couple of you have alluded to growing enrollment or having very successful enrollments even for this fall, because that's been a struggle for a lot of institutions. And so I'm curious, for those of you who have seen enrollment increases or seen enrollment increases in particular programs, how did you do that? What do you attribute those enrollments to? Did you decrease? Have you discounted enrollment? Have you increased funding? Are you really been focused more on the master's students? Like, what has happened? And just, another question is relaxed standards, does that have anything to do with it or not?
We are up about 1,000 graduate students this year over last year. And we are up both for master's degree students by a very significant amount, but also about a 6 to 8% increase in doctoral enrollments. So on the face of it, that sounds like it's an altogether good story, and it's certainly not bad. But if you look a little bit deeper, at the master's degree level, the growth has been largely in large online degrees, and most particularly with our collaboration with Coursera. So we have an IMBA degree, we have a Master of Computer Science degrees, we have 4 degrees with Coursera that are going like gangbusters. People really want those degrees. They're offered at a premium price. The students in those degrees are more diverse. We're very proud of the master's degree growth. When you look at the doctoral students, although the total number of enrolled students is up by about 800 or so, if you look at the number of new students, that's down relative to last year. Now, if the numbers of new students are down, but your total enrollment is up, that tells you that students didn't graduate at the same rate as the new students were coming in. And it tells us that students are taking longer to get out. And I think that's a nationwide problem. The pandemic has probably slowed down the progress of some of our students. Now, at Illinois, something like 40%, 45% of our doctoral students are international. And if you look at international graduate students, they are down by 30% across our institution. And so just simply looking at the total numbers of students often hides some of the challenges that we're facing. So we are working really hard to communicate with every one of the students who deferred their admission from this fall to some subsequent semester. We have 1,700 graduate students for whom we deferred admission. We are sending all of them our weekly graduate student newsletter. We're encouraging them to claim their university net ID and build a relationship with us, because we've made a commitment to admit them, but they have no commitment to come to us. And so what we want to do is try to maximize our ability to keep in touch with those students and to build their commitment to our institution as opposed to someone else.
I would echo the comment that around online education, because we only have a small number of online programs, graduate programs, only about 5 or 6. But at the master's level, they constitute 45% of our entire enrollment. One such program is our MBA program, and they established a memorandum of understanding agreement with AT&T, one of our corporate sponsors. And so AT&T employees can go directly to that Master's of Business Administration program. And that program is gone from 0 to about 150 students in little over 3 years. So we like that model, and we hope that we can continue to begin new programs with the similar model. You asked the question about what the key to enrollment growth was. I wish we could say that this was the one thing that had the largest return on our investment, if you will, in terms of related to graduate enrollment. But we've been doing a lot of things over the last 2 or so years, because prior to my entrance into this position as an interim about 2 years ago, we had experienced declining enrollments. And so we stopped the bleeding, if you will, and began to make a turn in the positive direction. And we've done many, many things around graduate student retention, like he was speaking about, mentorship, training, support, increasing graduate student support, and a myriad of things, in addition to marketing our graduate programs. So I think it's a collection of a lot of different strategies that we've put in place that brought us to the point where we started to experience an increase in enrollment.
I think for us, the picture is a little bit more mixed. The economic impact, I think, of the crisis affects people very differently. Some people have actually spoken about like the first major female recession that we're seeing. You know, the jobs in the front line have disappeared to such a degree that our median income has actually gone up because the entire bottom of the scale has sort of dropped out. And so there are different effects from it. We see most of our graduate programs are like the female students are in education, in health and human services, nursing, that those are also the professions that are maybe most hard hit by the pandemic itself. The schools and the health systems are in a major crisis. In Minnesota, it was decided that every school district decides for themselves if they're in person or online or any mixture of it. And they are sort of hectic decision making at the local level. So all of them are constantly going back and forth. And this group of students also is most typically like of the age where they have a family. So the concerns about their own children, I think, is a major additional burden, as they have to be taught at home, and you know there's only so many machines and so much internet bandwidth that goes around there, plus you know the time, the patience that it takes to do this for upward of a year. Whereas I think with male students, we see more of an increase, maybe as people struggle to maintain the employment, or employers are contracting, that there's a hope that an additional degree or a certificate or so will keep them viable, will sort of support their careers going forward. So there's maybe an increase there. We didn't see any changes in the funded positions that are research oriented, and we actually had the same number of international students joining us this year as in the past years on average. So we have seen a very strong increase in new students, but in our world, we have also seen sort of like a dropping out of students at the bottom, so to speak, students who were already in the system, who find it very hard right now to continue, either because of personal reasons or financial reasons.
So a lot of the conversation, especially around this idea of growth and where there's been growth, has focused on sort of master's programs. And it sounds like a lot of those are sort of professionally geared sort of master's programs. One of the sort of newer topics that's come up is about professional doctorates and professional doctorates in sciences and related fields. I'm curious if any of your institutions have been looking at those. Is that an area of innovation or growth that you see? What experience or sort of tips or ideas do you have around sort of professional doctorate degrees?
I mean, my answer can be very short, so maybe I'll go first this time. We have 2 professional doctoral programs. We're building 2 more right now in applied behavioral analysis, which is under psychology. Our program is majorly focused on autism. And so in the PsyD program, we're hoping to educate students to not only be doctorally prepared practitioners in their field, but also to have the managerial and financial chops to run a large practice successfully. And the other one is a doctorate of nursing practice that we're launching. So I definitely think that in the field of applied doctoral programs, that there's a need and a growth opportunity.
I'd say that at Illinois, the decision to launch a professional doctorate degree is definitely one that is decentralized and is up to each individual academic college. So we have a small number of professional doctorates, doctor in audiology, for example. We also have EDD degrees, but I don't think we have a central campus policy that either advocates for or against having those degrees. There's a lot of leeway. If a program sees a value and a demand in developing a professional graduate program, whether it's at the master's or doctoral level, we certainly would not stand in the way of that.
And we have a small number of PhD programs, 0 professional doctorate degrees. Most of our PhD programs are in STEM field.
Well, thanks. I'm going to have, I've got 2 more questions left, and we've got about a little over 5 minutes, 6 minutes. So hopefully these are relatively short. But I'm curious about the question that came in had to do with understanding that obviously the research experiences of our incoming students might be somewhat limited now, even this year or in coming years. And so I'm wondering, what have you all been doing with that? Whether have you been working with admissions committees on that, but how have you addressed that that concern amongst incoming students and just sort of the ongoing sort of viability of research projects?
We've surveyed every one of our programs, and we've asked them to respond to us what has been the impact on early stage doctoral students. That means students prior to prelims, and late stage doctoral students. And what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of variability. I mean, there are some programs that have been much more affected than others. And our thought was that what we need to do initially is simply gather the data and then break it down and collate it so that we could understand some of the challenges that students and programs are facing, and then, in a sense, broker a conversation about mentoring, broker a conversation about changes in the way we think about doctoral education. You know, maybe some of the work of the AAU PhD initiative, some of the work of the National Academy's report on the future of the doctorate, which has been recommending a more student-centered focus in doctoral education, if you like, a move away from the apprenticeship model led by a single advisor. I think all of those factors are being accelerated and playing into effect more as a result of the pandemic.
Let me twist the question. I think that was that's wonderful. No, I'm not. You didn't answer a wrong question. I'm going to tweak it for the last two before we get to the last question, which is, what about in the admissions decision-making process? So a lot of our programs are obviously research-based programs, and so a lot of the incoming students are expected to have some research experience. But with everything that's happened, that may not be as possible, or may not be the same. So Clay or Claudia, any thoughts about how your admissions officials have looked at those sort of disruptions in terms of what applicants may have been able to do in their research?
Yeah, I mean, I can be very short. We have been looking at it very benignly. I mean, most campuses closed around the middle of March, so that is the last, 10 weeks of a student's career. So I think there's more to look at than the disrupted projects of the last semester.
From an admissions perspective, we have each of our programs looking at their admissions process and trying to identify a more holistic application process. We just begin by asking them the question, what do you want in a student to be admitted into your program, and what does that look like? So we try to have an admissions process that's set around allowing a student to promote those type of experiences wherever possible. We also, on our campus, we're engaged with reopening research. And so I think we prioritized it this way, where students who were near their degree completion, they were given access first. Well after those students, who absolutely had to come to campus to maintain their experiments because they had some biological specimens, or they were on the farm with animals, etc. And then as things increased in terms of phases, then we increased student access.
I mean, that is very interesting. And to add to that, I think also for us, for our own students, their access was not necessarily much diminished. One way that we chose to go to allow students to continue to work in the lab or on campus somewhere was to create sort of what we call pandemic pods, so we identify a small group of people who always use the space together and who are tasked to sort of keep each other safe and enforce life practices that will prevent infection of anyone. We also use that ourselves among staff and faculty. So in my office, there are always the same 2 people there every day, and everyone else stays at home, so that if one person becomes infected, they don't take everyone down. And I think that is one of the things we will stay with, because we have found that those smaller pods of students who are always using the lab at the same time actually become good friends, and it's a way for them to develop belonging and some relationships on campus. So that was sort of something we happened upon that we're excited about.
That's great. So we're about out of time. And so I want to have one sort of final question. It's going to be a teaser because you all need to be very, very short. We've only got like a minute left total. But I want to set up sort of the next session. So the next session is about sustainability and all that. So we know that the pandemic has impacted all of us in so many different ways. And you all and everyone in this has done a lot of stuff to innovate. But I'm curious if you could share maybe one, maybe two very quick areas or challenges where you're still looking for help. So what are the things that you still want to solve or that you still need a little bit of input on? That may give us a teaser. And also, let's be honest, normalize the whole situation for the rest of us. It's not like we've got everything figured out yet.
We need to figure out how to right size our graduate programs for the needs of our nation moving forward. And secondly, I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that we need to build better relationships with our partners in the community, in industry, so as to make sure that the graduate programs we offer are delivering the students with the expertise that are needed in our nation post-pandemic.
I think that COVID created an environment whereby it exposed, if you will, some areas where we need significant improvement around graduate education. And I look at the opportunities for us to transform graduate education to some new state that we have not experienced yet, and to better prepare our students for the career pathways that they actually land in.
Yeah, I'd say the pandemic has especially hit communities of color and other groups of students that are currently underserved or underrepresented. These are the same groups that are hit by the disease load and also by the loss of like millions of positions across our economy. How can we remain accessible with the funding models that we have, where such a large part of the cost of the education is normally borne by the students?
That's great. So that's all we've got time for. You three have been wonderful. Really, thank you for sharing so much of what you've been doing on your campuses. We're now going to pause for a break and just meet us back here at about 3:30 p.m. So the bottom of the hour. Thanks so much.